Welcome, lovebirds, to another exciting episode of Hearts Wine from Hearts Distractions. I'm so glad you're here today because we're about to dive into one of the most essential yet often misunderstood elements of a lasting relationship. Yes, vulnerability. Now, I know that the idea of vulnerability can stir up a lot of emotions. Some of us might associate vulnerability with weakness. After all, who wants to expose themselves to potential hurt? But what if I told you that vulnerability could be the key to building a stronger, more resilient connection with your partner? But here's the thing, it's not always easy. Vulnerability is risky. It can leave us feeling exposed and scared. Yet, when done right, it opens the door to deeper emotional intimacy and trust. That's why today we're exploring whether vulnerability really strengthens our bond, or if it's a risk we should avoid. Let's take a moment to share a story, more so a personal story, to illustrate the power of vulnerability. I'll never forget the first time I shared a deeply personal fear with my partner. It was after a long, stressful week at work, and I was feeling completely overwhelmed. I didn't want to burden my partner with my worries, but there was something about my partner's presence that made me feel safe. The moment I let down my guard and expressed what was really going on, something shifted in me. Not only did my partner listen attentively, but responded with empathy and support, which is what I needed at the time. In that moment, I felt seen and understood. We didn't just connect on a surface level, but definitely on an emotional level, because I allowed my partner to see me at my most vulnerable, and instead of rejecting me, my partner embraced my vulnerable side. And that's the beauty of vulnerability. It's an invitation to truly be seen for who you are, with all your imperfections, fears, and desires. But it's not just a one-way street. Both partners need to be willing to engage in vulnerability for it to work. This brings me to an essential question. Can vulnerability truly strengthen our bond, or is it something that leaves us open to hurt? I'm your relationship expert with over 20 years of professional and personal experience. Now I get to be your host in addition to being a wife, a mother, a marriage and family therapist who's licensed. If you didn't know, I'm someone who's passionate about helping people navigate the ups and downs of love and relationships. I understand relationships on all levels, while also recognizing and calling out the things that most don't acknowledge, including family, friendships, and how mental health plays out in relationships. I'm also a relationship coach, an entrepreneur of 2 businesses, and the author of Distractions of the Heart, a poetry book all about the messy, beautiful emotions and relationships we experience and carry in our hearts. And when I'm not having deep conversations or helping others, you might catch me mixing up a drink or two. Yeah, of course, I'm a bit of a mixologist at heart and enjoy coming up with new flavored cocktails that might be coming your way soon. So grab your glass of wine, get comfortable, and of course, let's talk about all the heart's distractions that cause your heart to whine in your new favorite relationship podcast. Vulnerability. It's one of those words we hear all the time, but what does it really mean in the context of relationships? How do we define vulnerability when it comes to love, intimacy, and connection? According to Brené Brown, vulnerability is about uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's about showing up as your true self in a relationship without any pretenses or filters, and allowing your partner to see you in your most authentic state. But let's get deep. Vulnerability isn't just about sharing your fears and weaknesses. It's also about allowing your partner to see your hopes, dreams, desires, and even your excitement and joy. Vulnerability is about expressing all of who you are without the fear of rejection. Here's the thing. Vulnerability is often misunderstood as weakness. Ooh, that's a scary word. We tend to think that being vulnerable means we're weak, that we're opening ourselves up to hurt. But actually, vulnerability takes strength. It takes an immense amount of courage to let someone see you at your rawest. most unpolished form. It's much easier to hide behind a facade and keep things surface level than it is to open up and be real with someone. Here's a quote that I want to share with y'all. Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Thank you, Brené Brown, for that quote right there. This quote by Brené Brown highlights a key point that we all need to catch. Vulnerability is about showing up, fully present in the moment, no matter the outcome. It's about being authentic with your partner, knowing full well that they might not always respond in the way you hope or expect. But the true power of vulnerability is that it invites connection. It creates an emotional space where both partners can be real without the fear of judgment. For example, imagine you've had a really rough week and you feel like you're at the end of your rope. You've been bottling up your stress and it's starting to affect your relationship. Instead of pretending everything is fine, you decide to open up to your partner. You share how overwhelmed you feel, and without fear, you let them see the vulnerability beneath your external strength. At that moment, you're not just sharing your struggles, you're offering your partner a deeper understanding of who you are and what's really going on inside. You're letting them in, giving them a chance to see the emotional depth of your experience. Let that one soak in. When you let your guard down and allow yourself to be vulnerable, you open the door to a deeper emotional connection with your partner. This connection is not just about physical attraction or surface level conversations. Vulnerability allows you to connect on a profound emotional level that is often absent in more superficial relationships. Let's take a closer look at some of the benefits of vulnerability in relationships. Emotional intimacy is the foundation of any meaningful relationship. It's not just about sharing surface level details of your day. It's about being able to open up about your inner world, your fears, your hopes, and your dreams. Vulnerability creates emotional intimacy because it allows you to move beyond small talk and dive into deeper conversations that foster understanding and connection. Trust is one of the cornerstones of healthy relationships. When we are vulnerable with someone, we're showing them that we trust them enough to let our guard down. And when that trust is reciprocated, it creates a bond that is incredibly strong and difficult to break. Vulnerability isn't just about sharing your struggles, it's also about sharing your triumphs, joys, and aspirations. When both partners engage in vulnerability, the relationship becomes stronger, more resilient, and more capable of weathering life's challenges. You know, those storms that come your way that try to break apart your relationship. I'm just saying. Also, when one partner shares something deeply personal, the other has an opportunity to step into their shoes and see the world from their perspective. This fosters empathy, understanding, and compassion, which can strengthen the emotional bond between both partners. Research from the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy shows that couples who communicate openly and vulnerably tend to have longer lasting, more fulfilling relationships. Hear me on this one, people? Because when couples engage in vulnerability, they create a space for emotional growth and understanding. It's in those moments of vulnerability that you truly get to know each other on a deeper level. And of course, vulnerability isn't without its risks. While vulnerability has the potential to strengthen your bond, it can also expose you to emotional hurt and rejection if it's not handled with care. One of the biggest fears people have about vulnerability is the fear of being hurt. What if I open up and my partner doesn't understand me? That's a valid question. What if I share my innermost feelings and they respond with indifference, or even worse, dismiss my emotions altogether? I know I've definitely been there. There's some real fears here. Vulnerability can leave us exposed, and there's always a possibility that our partner might not respond in the way we expect. But as we've discussed earlier, vulnerability takes courage. If you want to build a deeper connection, you have to be willing to take those risks. I remember a couple I knew who had been together for several years. One partner had always been emotionally reserved, not wanting to show vulnerability for fear of being rejected. But one day, after a particularly challenging event, of course, they decided to share their deepest feelings with their partner. Unfortunately, the other partner was not emotionally equipped to handle this level of vulnerability. They responded defensively, not understanding why the other person was so upset, and instead of comforting them, they became dismissive. This response caused a rift in the relationship. Instead of creating emotional intimacy, vulnerability, in this case, led to emotional distance. The lesson here is that vulnerability requires both partners to be in the right emotional space to respond with care and understanding. When vulnerability isn't met with empathy, it can cause more harm than good. A lack of vulnerability in a relationship can be just as damaging as vulnerability without emotional readiness. If one partner is consistently unwilling to be vulnerable, it can create emotional distance and lead to communication breakdowns. Here are some red flags that indicate a lack of vulnerability in your relationship. Lack of emotional availability is number one. When one partner is consistently distant or shuts down during emotional conversations, it's a sign they may not be ready to open up. Emotional availability is essential for creating a vulnerable connection. If your partner always reacts defensively when you try to express your feelings, it can shut down the possibility for healthy vulnerability. A defensiveness response suggests that your partner is uncomfortable with emotional openness. So give them a little space and allow them to get a little comfortable. Don't keep pushing. It's not your responsibility to take care of them. It's their responsibility to take care of themselves. Emotional withdrawal. This is when one partner pulls away during moments of emotional distress. Instead of offering comfort or understanding, they withdraw, leaving the other person feeling unsupported and isolated. And lastly, while independence is important, an overemphasis on emotional independence can be a sign of avoidance. If your partner believes vulnerability is a weakness, they may avoid showing their true emotions altogether. I once spoke with a couple who experienced this very issue. One partner struggled to open up while the other partner felt rejected. Over time, this emotional withdrawal created tension, leading to misunderstandings and hurt feelings. The couple worked through it by creating a safe space to share their vulnerabilities, which ultimately brought them closer together. What about generational and societal views, you ask? Well, I wouldn't be a marriage and family therapist if I didn't touch on this area for further personal understanding and clarity. Now, would I? Generational influences can have a profound impact on how we view vulnerability. Many of us grew up in environments where emotional expression wasn't always encouraged, especially from men. The message often conveyed was that being tough and stoic was a sign of strength, while showing emotion or vulnerability was seen as weakness. In fact, men's vulnerability is often discouraged in many cultures. Phrases like, "big boys don't cry," or "man up," are still commonly heard, leaving men to suppress their emotions and avoid vulnerability in relationships. But as we know, emotional repression can lead to unhealthy patterns in relationships, such as difficulty expressing feelings, emotional detachment, or even frustration and anger. The one thing I want y'all to remember is through this quote, our families didn't teach us to be vulnerable. They taught us to be survivors. Think about the generation your parents and grandparents grew up in, and trust me, it will all make sense. Baby boomers lived in survival mode, which is something this generation is now learning with all the things happening with this new administration and government. I'm not hopping on that soap opera box because, trust me, I can go on for hours with politics. But to continue the discussion, this societal and generational pressure to suppress vulnerability has a lasting impact on modern relationships. Couples who are raised with these views may struggle to navigate emotional intimacy and healthy vulnerability as adults. Another couple I knew experienced this firsthand. One partner was raised in a family where emotions were never discussed, and vulnerability was seen as a sign of weakness. The other partner, on the other hand, grew up in a family where emotions were openly expressed. This difference in upbringing led to confusion and frustration in their relationship until they both recognized the role that generational influences played in their behavior. Now that we've explored the importance, risks, and challenges of vulnerability, let's get into the practical side of things. How do we actually practice vulnerability in a way that enhances our relationships and fosters deeper connections? The first thing to understand is that vulnerability doesn't happen overnight. It's something you have to practice and nurture. It's not about opening up all at once, but rather finding small ways to share your feelings and emotions on a daily basis. So start small. If you're not used to being vulnerable, it can feel overwhelming to dive into deep emotional conversations right away. That's okay. Vulnerability is a skill that builds over time. Start small by sharing little things such as how you're feeling emotionally at the start of your day or what's weighing on your mind. Over time, these small acts of vulnerability can open the door to deeper, more meaningful conversations with your partner. For instance, you might start by sharing a moment of gratitude with your partner at the end of the day. It could be something simple like, I really appreciate how supportive you were when I was stressed about work today. This doesn't necessarily expose your deepest insecurities, but it's a form of vulnerability that helps you open up to each other. Being honest is a fundamental part of vulnerability, but it's also important to be thoughtful. Think about the timing of your vulnerability. It's not just about what you share, but when you share it. Choose a moment when both you and your partner are emotionally available to handle the conversation. If your partner is already stressed or distracted, it might not be the best time to share something deeply personal. Consider your partner's emotional state and be mindful of how they might respond. Vulnerability works best when both partners are in a receptive emotional space. If they seem overwhelmed or distant, it might be a sign that you need to wait for a better time. It's easy to show vulnerability in positive moments, like when you're celebrating a success or sharing something funny, but real vulnerability comes from sharing your fears, anxieties, and insecurities. Let your partner see the parts of you that are uncertain or unsure. This level of honesty fosters deep emotional intimacy and trust. For example, sharing a fear such as, I'm really scared that I'm not enough for you, can create an opportunity for your partner to offer reassurance and empathy. It gives them the chance to truly support you in ways that go beyond surface level interactions. I love that. Here's a quote. Love is not about perfect moments. It's about being vulnerable with one another in those imperfect moments. I don't know what author said that, but I had to share that quote with y'all because it touched my heart. Because when you show up in your most vulnerable state, it creates an opportunity for both of you to connect on a deeper level. This vulnerability creates a bond that no amount of surface level conversation can replicate. Hear me on this one. I know a couple who was struggling with communication. One partner had a deep fear of being abandoned, which led them to avoid sharing their true feelings. They realized that their emotional distance was causing friction in their relationship. The breakthrough came when they both decided to open up about their deepest fears. The moment they did, the walls came down and their connection deepened. It wasn't easy, but it was a transformative situation moment. As much as we may want to embrace vulnerability, we must acknowledge that not everyone is emotionally ready or capable of handling it. If vulnerability is met with dismissiveness, criticism, or rejection, it can be damaging to both the individual and the relationship. One of the most damaging things that can happen when you open up is when your partner doesn't respond with empathy. If they dismiss your feelings, mock you, or react with indifference, it creates emotional distance and may even cause you to shut down emotionally. This can lead to resentment and mistrust. I heard about a couple where one partner tried to open up about their feelings of inadequacy in a relationship. They shared how they were feeling neglected and unloved, hoping for understanding. However, the other partner responded by saying, "You're being dramatic. Get over it." This response shut down any further emotional conversation and created a deep rift in the relationship. It was a painful reminder that vulnerability requires sensitivity and care from both partners. But guess what? They learned their lesson. Another issue arises when one partner reacts by withdrawing emotionally. If you try to express your vulnerabilities and your partner retreats or becomes emotionally unavailable, it can create a sense of abandonment or isolation. In the long run, this behavior erodes trust and makes it harder to maintain a strong emotional bond. For example, imagine you open up about feeling insecure in your career, and your partner responds by pulling away and not offering any support. This emotional withdrawal can lead to feelings of loneliness and make you hesitant to share anything vulnerable in the future. Emotional withdrawal is a major red flag, by the way, in relationships and needs to be addressed immediately. Another common reaction is defensiveness. If one partner gets defensive when vulnerability is shared, they may feel like the other person is blaming them or attacking them. This defensiveness reaction often comes from a place of insecurity, but it can prevent the vulnerability from being fully understood or supported. For instance, imagine you open up about feeling neglected, and your partner immediately starts listing all the ways they feel neglected too. Who's been there? I know I have. Instead of addressing your feelings, they turn the conversation around to themselves, leaving you feeling unheard and unsupported. According to a study from the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, over 40% of couples report experiencing emotional withdrawal or lack of support when one partner expresses vulnerability. This lack of emotional responsiveness can significantly harm the relationship and make it harder for both partners to communicate openly. If you encounter these situations, it's essential to address the issue calmly and respectfully. Express how you feel about the response to your vulnerability and communicate that you need empathy and support in return. In healthy relationships, both partners should feel safe to open up without fear of judgment or emotional backlash. While vulnerability is incredibly powerful, it's important to strike a balance between emotional openness and self-protection. Hear me on this one, people. Vulnerability should never come at the expense of your emotional well-being. It's crucial to know when to open up and when to hold back. You don't need to share every single thought or feeling with your partner. Vulnerability is about sharing the right things at the right time. For example, it might be a good time to open up when you're both in a calm, receptive space. However, if your partner is going through a stressful period or if the relationship is in a volatile place, it might be best to hold off on heavy emotional disclosures until the time is right. Being vulnerable can be emotionally exhausting, especially if your partner is not responsive. If you continuously share your emotions and vulnerabilities without receiving the same level of openness in return, it can lead to burnout. In these cases, it's important to check in with yourself and make sure you're not emotionally overexposing yourself. And last, for vulnerability to work in a relationship, both partners need to engage in it. It's not enough for just one person to share their deepest emotions while the other holds back. Vulnerability should be reciprocal, creating a two-way street where both partners feel safe to open up. As Brené Brown would say, vulnerability is the birthplace of connection and a path to the feeling of worthiness. Therefore, in a healthy relationship, both partners are willing to share and receive vulnerability. This mutual exchange strengthens the emotional bond and deepens the connection. As we wrap up today's conversation, I want you to remember one thing. Vulnerability is not a weakness, it is a tool for deeper connection, growth, and trust. When practiced thoughtfully, it can transform your relationship into something stronger, more resilient, and emotionally rich. But as with anything valuable, it requires care, mutual respect, and understanding from both partners. So I challenge you to reflect on your own relationship. Are you allowing vulnerability to play a role in your connection? Or are you holding back, afraid of what might happen if you open up? I hope today's episode has inspired you to embrace vulnerability in your relationship. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Hearts Flying from Heart's Distractions for exclusive content and behind the scenes material, and share it with someone else so they can subscribe too. And or visit our website at www.aliciasdistractions.com for more resources and tips on deepening your connection and access to the podcast itself. And as always, follow us on social media, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Leave us your questions, leave us your responses to this episode, or give us some new, fresh topics that you might want to see covered. Thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, vulnerability isn't just about being exposed. It's about creating the space for growth, connection, and love in your relationship. Keep opening up and watch your relationship flourish. Cheers!